Athens, in the 5th century before the Common Era, stood like a mirror, polished by ambition, dazzling the Aegean with its marble temples and proud talk of democracy, reason, and the love of beauty. Yet behind that perfection moved an invisible world of slaves, servants, and foreigners whose labor fed the brilliance that excluded them. Among them was a boy from the Ionian coast, sold after famine forced his family into debt. At the slave market near the Piraeus harbor, a wealthy citizen, Diodorus, son of Phanius, noticed the symmetry of his face and the calm in his eyes, and bought him not for toil, but for display. The boy's name was stripped away and replaced with Carinides, the one who crosses shadows, a poetic mask that hid the fact of ownership. He was washed in oil, taught to bow, and dressed in linen finer than anything he had worn as a free child. Diodorus prided himself on culture. He collected scrolls, sculptures, and now a living embodiment of both. The villa where he lived stood below the Acropolis, filled with the scent of wine and burning myrrh. In its courtyards, men of learning gathered each night for the symposium, that peculiar invention of Athens where intellect and indulgence shared the same couch. There, reclining on embroidered cushions, citizens discussed justice, courage, and love, while slaves like Carinides poured their wine and tuned the flutes. They called these evenings the School of Virtue, insisting that affection between man and youth purified the soul. The poets cited Zeus and Ganymede as divine precedent. Philosophers declared that beauty led the mind upward to truth. No one mentioned that the beloved's consent was presumed, not granted. Carinides quickly understood that Athens had mastered the art of naming its desires as ideals. He learned to move gracefully, to smile without revealing thought, to be seen but never present. Diodorus's affection came wrapped in pedagogy, lessons in music, rhetoric, and obedience. The boy memorized Homeric verses, recited them in the measured rhythm his master preferred, and realized that knowledge could chain as tightly as ignorance. To the guests, he was proof that refinement could be purchased. To himself, he became a reflection without substance. At night, he lay awake, listening to the city hum beyond the walls, and wondered whether the gods, who demanded worship, felt the same loneliness as those who were adored. Years passed within the marble calm of servitude until war broke the illusion of permanence. Sparta challenged Athens, and citizens who once debated virtue now marched to defend it. Diodorus, seeking honor, joined the naval expedition and took Carinides as attendant. For the boy, the sea was revelation, wind without command, waves that answered to no master. He carried water, cleaned armor, and watched free men bleed for glory. In battle, he saw courage stripped of rhetoric, sweat, fear, and chance deciding who lived to boast of philosophy. When an arrow pierced Diodorus's thigh, Carinides dragged him from the field, binding the wound with torn linen, while the shouts of dying men echoed over the surf. Fever made the master human. Between groans, he confessed regrets and promised freedom if they both survived. The boy believed him not from faith, but from the hunger to believe something. When they returned to Athens, the promise vanished like mist. Diodorus limped through the agora receiving applause for valor. The boy followed behind, unnoticed. At the next symposium, guests praised the beauty of his servant who had saved his life, and the laughter that followed reminded Carinides how easily gratitude became possession. Yet something within him had shifted. He had seen a world larger than marble walls. Now he measured Athens not by its temples, but by its silences, the silence of slaves forbidden to speak of truth. He began to steal moments at dawn to walk near the docks, watching ships vanish into the horizon and thinking that perhaps freedom was not a place but the refusal to forget one's own mind. Time, however, is another master. Diodorus's ambitions turned domestic. He sought a respectable marriage. The new wife, stern and wealthy, viewed the handsome attendant as a blemish on virtue. Without protest, Diodorus dismissed him to the servants' wing, providing coarse garments and the dignity of invisibility. For Charonides, it was the gentlest exile he had ever known. No longer forced to smile, he labored in the storerooms, carried amphorae, tended the hearth. Among kitchen slaves, he discovered laughter unchained by etiquette. The simplicity of work soothed him. Creation, however humble, was cleaner than ornament. Yet freedom remained a dream spoken only in whispers. The city punished runaways with crucifixion at the gates. He saw the bodies and learned the price of hope. When plague struck Athens, sweeping through houses noble and poor alike, he stayed while others fled. He burned linens, fetched water for the dying, and saw that death at last practiced the equality philosophers preached. Diodorus fell ill and, in terror, begged the boy to remain by his side. Charonides obeyed, not from loyalty, but because leaving would mean surrendering his last scrap of humanity. When the master recovered, gratitude curdled into shame. He could not bear the memory of dependence. Soon afterward, he settled a debt by transferring ownership of the slave who had saved his life. The sale was written in 2 lines on a wax tablet, erases 10 years of shared history. The new household belonged to a potter who valued hands more than faces. There, in a quarter thick with clay dust and smoke, Charonides learned to knead earth into form, to turn the wheel until formless matter acquired symmetry. The labor roughened his palms but cleansed his spirit. He worked beside men who cursed taxes, sang bawdy songs, and judged a person only by endurance. None called him ornament, none demanded beauty. For the first time, he felt the weight of usefulness, not display. Sometimes, while shaping a jar, he imagined that the clay remembered its freedom in the riverbed, and he whispered to it as to a brother. One night, after the kiln cooled, he took a shard and scratched upon it a thought forbidden to his kind. I have seen the soul of the city, and it is afraid of its reflection. He hid the piece beneath the floor. Centuries later, it would be found by archaeologists who attributed it to an unknown philosopher. They would never guess that the hand which wrote it once poured wine for the wise. As years thinned his hair and blurred his youth, he watched new boys arrive at the port, sold for the same reasons, smiling the same trained smile. The pattern seemed eternal. Beauty purchased, virtue preached, mercy forgotten. Occasionally, he heard news of Diodorus, failed investments, political exile, an unremarked death. The philosophers composed speeches praising his moderation and intellect. None mentioned the lives behind his leisure. By then, Athens itself had begun to crumble under war and exhaustion. Statues still shone, but the faith that built them had cracked. Charonides, old and stooped, sat each evening outside the workshop watching smoke drift toward the Acropolis. He no longer hated the city. Hatred implied expectation. Instead, he felt the calm of understanding. He had lived long enough to see ideals devour their believers. The democracy that spoke of freedom survived only through forgetting its dependence on chains. Perhaps, he thought, Every civilization must lie to itself to endure. As twilight colored the sky, he murmured that the gods of Greece had died of admiration, destroyed by the perfection men demanded of them. He smiled at the irony. The boy once owned for his beauty had outlived the world that bought him. When night deepened and the kiln's embers dimmed, he lay down beside the cooling clay and felt no fear. The air smelled of smoke and earth, the scent of all things returning to origin. His last thought was that freedom was not escape, but comprehension. The moment one sees the world clearly and chooses not to bow to it. Somewhere in the city, another youth was being renamed and trained for the symposium. The pattern would begin again, but among the shards of forgotten pottery, a single sentence waited, carrying his memory into the centuries that would call Athens the cradle of reason and never imagined the cost of its light. In the years that followed, Athens continued to speak of greatness even as its glory decayed like bronze left to salt and air. The philosophers still argued in shaded porticos, tracing perfect circles of logic that no longer matched the crookedness of the streets. Ships returned empty from ruined colonies, debt crushed farmers, citizens sold sons to the same markets that had once fed the city's appetite for beauty. Caronides, now old enough that the scars on his hands had become his only adornment, watched this slow unraveling with a stillness mistaken for calm. He had seen the foundations of the empire, greed, vanity, and denial, long before the stones began to crack. The pottery quarter where he lived lay outside the sacred walls, where smoke blurred the horizon and the smell of clay mixed with sewage. There the talk was not of ideals, but of hunger, of taxes, of the price of firewood. Among the artisans, he was simply the old one with the sea-colored eyes, and that anonymity was the only freedom he had ever owned. Sometimes travelers from the islands brought tales of rebellions, of slaves forming hidden camps in the hills, of dreams of equality that flickered and died as soon as soldiers arrived. He listened, neither hoping nor despairing, knowing that every revolt would be buried under the same marble that decorated the temples of reason. His own revolt had long since turned inward. The refusal to forget, the refusal to believe that civilization and cruelty were opposites. He spoke little, but when younger workers mocked philosophy, he surprised them by saying that philosophy was useful. It taught masters how to sleep after doing harm. They laughed uneasily, unsure whether he mocked them or the world. The years made him smaller, bent like a question mark no one cared to answer. He moved slowly through lanes once bright with music, now haunted by beggars and soldiers returned from endless war. Occasionally, he passed the ruins of a house he recognized, the old villa of Diodoros, its columns blackened, its garden choked with weeds. The marble statues had toppled. A single arm of some forgotten god lay half buried in dust. He stood there once, staring at it, realizing that art decays exactly as the flesh it idealizes. The city that had taught the world perfection could not save itself from erosion. Yet Athenians still held processions to honor the memory of what they believed they still were. The speeches grew more desperate, praising virtue with words worn thin by repetition. Truth, he thought, survives not in monuments, but in the silence those monuments try to cover. At night, in his narrow room beside the kiln, he sometimes traced the air with his finger as if writing invisible lines. He no longer needed ink. The act itself was enough to prove he existed. When he coughed, clay dust came up in the sputum. The potter's wife gave him watered wine and muttered that he was near the end. He thanked her without fear. To die as a man who had belonged to himself, even quietly, was a kind of victory denied to kings. One evening, during the winter storms, soldiers arrived at the workshop demanding conscripts to repair city walls. They took the younger men and ignored the old. Carinides watched them march away and thought of the first war he had seen. The faces identical across decades, each generation born to repeat the same lesson. That night, the wind howled through broken tiles, and rain seeped into the kiln. He sat beside the dying embers and whispered to the fire as if it were the only listener left, that Athens had conquered the world with words and lost it through forgetting what words meant. His breath grew shallow, but memory sharpened. He saw again the boy at the harbor, his mother's hand slipping from his arm, the marble rooms, the laughter of men who mistook possession for love, the plague, the pottery, the endless smoke. He wondered whether any of it had mattered, whether survival without witness was not another form of erasure. Yet, even as he doubted, a strange calm entered him. Perhaps meaning itself was a luxury of the powerful. Perhaps endurance was enough. Near dawn, he lay down on the clay floor, the warmth of the kiln fading beneath his back, and listened to the rain tap the roof like distant applause. When the potter found him at sunrise, the old slave's eyes were open, fixed toward the light, a faint smile on his lips as if greeting something familiar. No one recorded his name. The city registers did not mark the deaths of property. His body was wrapped in a work cloth and buried beyond the wall reserved for those without citizenship. A few days later, the river flooded, washing the grave clean. The water carried fragments of broken pottery downstream, among them a shard scratched with faint letters almost erased by time. Fishermen found it lodged in the mud and tossed it aside. Years later, a scholar digging for relics uncovered it and puzzled over the half-legible phrase, "the soul of the city, its reflection." He catalogued it without comment, another curiosity from the ruins of a civilization praised for its enlightenment. Centuries passed. Rome rose where Athens had fallen, inheriting its gods, its language, and its blindness. The philosophers of the new empire quoted Plato while buying children from the same coasts, and no one remembered the hand that had written on the shard. It lay in a collector's cabinet, admired for its age, not its meaning. The museums of later ages would call it evidence of early moral skepticism, never imagining that it had been written by a man who never had the right to speak. And perhaps that was fitting. History, Carinides would have said, is the art of forgetting who paid for wisdom. The streets of Athens became dust, the temple's ruins visited by tourists who saw beauty but not cost. Guides told stories of philosophers, generals, and sculptors. No one mentioned the slaves who mixed the lime or carried the marble. Yet, if one stands at the Piraeus docks at dusk, when the wind blows from the sea, the air still carries a faint tang of clay and smoke, and the gulls cry like distant voices. In that sound, there lingers an unspoken truth, that the cradle of civilization rocked itself to sleep on chains. The democracy that taught the world to speak never learned to listen. The art that glorified the body ignored the bodies it consumed. The city that praised reason refused to reason with compassion. And so the end came not with conquest, but with silence, the same silence that had filled Carinides' life. His story was not exceptional. It was the rule hidden beneath the legend. Every empire, he might have said, is a temple built on the bones of those who believed too much in its light. When night finally swallows the Parthenon's outline and the marble fades to gray, that truth remains invisible but persistent, like a voice speaking from beneath the earth. The past is never noble. It is merely unfinished,